Hi, this is Ed Fitzpatrick. If you enjoy local politics as much as I do, be sure to join our friends at Rhode Island PBS for the show A Lively Experiment. Hosted by Jim Hummel, the weekly series features journalists, pundits, and politicians debating the stories and issues that matter most to us Rhode Islanders. Tune in to A Lively Experiment and be part of the conversation. Fridays at 7 p.m. on Rhode Island PBS and wherever you get your podcasts. From the Boston Globe, this is Rhode Island Report. I'm Ed Fitzpatrick. Welcome back to the podcast where we bring you big conversations from our very small state. The Rhode Island Black, Latino, Indigenous, Asian American, and Pacific Islander Caucus, or RIBLIA, is a growing presence in the State House. The group of more than 20 members just released its legislative priorities this week. Here to tell us more are RIBLIA's new co-chairs, Providence Democrats, Senator Tiara Mack and Representative David Morales. Senator Mack, Representative Morales, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having us, Ed.
Excited to be here.
So congratulations to both of you on being elected this year's co-chairs of the Rhode Island Black, Latino, Indigenous, Asian American, and Pacific Islander Caucus. Rep. Morales, how many members are in the caucus now?
We have 21 members across the House of Representatives and the Senate, and we're excited that each and every single year we're welcoming new members. This year we welcomed Senator Lamas Vargas, that represents Cranston and Providence, in addition to Representative Jenny Furtado, who represents East Providence.
Senator Mack, do you feel the caucus is reaching a point where it's having a significant impact on what legislation is passed each year at the General Assembly?
I think so. I think the more that we continue to flex our muscles as a group of Black and brown and traditionally marginalized voices in the State House, the more power we have in advancing conversations around important policies. Last year, a lot of the policy priorities that we had weren't just sponsored by RIBLIA caucus members, and this year as well, we have bills that have sponsors that are not members of the caucus, but really recognize that important pieces of legislation like raising the taxes on the top 1% of Rhode Islanders is important for not just Black and brown folks, but for all Rhode Islanders. And so that's one thing that I'm really proud of.
So I know the caucus met recently to set priorities for the 2025 legislative session. Rep. Morales, what are some of the major bills that the caucus wants to see passed this year?
Yeah, so over the course of this year, we will be prioritizing 15 pieces of legislation, some of which have a budgetary impact, some of which are strictly policy-oriented. But we're most excited about establishing a fair tax system where the wealthiest pay their fair share, because that allows for us to have the revenue needed in order to fund programs that are most important to our communities, from public education to transportation. In addition, we are continuing our efforts to increase the minimum wage, considering that over 70,000 Rhode Islanders earn the minimum wage, and more often than not, it is a person of color working a low-wage job.
Senator Mack, you mentioned that legislation that would raise the income tax rate for the richest 1% of Rhode Islanders. What's the rationale for it, and how much revenue would it raise?
It's estimated that this would raise about $190 million. And I think right now the context is even more important. One, it's always important to make sure that every Rhode Islander is pulling their fair share to make sure that critical programs like food assistance and housing assistance and healthcare insurance is accessible to all Rhode Islanders. This year in particular, with all of the attacks and all of the cuts of funding that we see at the national level, we know that Rhode Island stands to have about 30% of our budget in jeopardy due to cuts to Medicaid.
Is that what you're hearing, 30% of the budget?
Yeah, well,
wow.
30% of Rhode Island's budget is covered by federal sources, and a lot of that is through Medicaid. So if the federal government is still charged with finding $880 billion in cuts, Rhode Island inevitably is going to be impacted. And so raising revenue by making sure the top 1% of Rhode Islanders, which is about 2,000 Rhode Islanders, which in that context, you're like, well, this just makes sense.
And it's 2,000 Rhode Islanders who earn how much?
Over $625,000. So whatever that top 1% is, it fluctuates year to year. And I think it's also important context to know that a little bit over 15 years ago, this same tax bracket had a tax cut. So this is just correcting us losing about $1.3 billion since we made that tax rollback.
And I think Senate President Ruggiero was one of the advocates or co-sponsors of that legislation that cut the rate back then. And he always says, oh, people are going to move out of state if you raise the taxes on the highest earners. What do you say to that?
I say it's a myth, and all of the research shows that it is a myth. Massachusetts just passed similar legislation last year, and they were able to raise over $1 billion in the first year of implementation. And another thing I think is really important to know is that the research says that if one wealthy person leaves, another person, especially given our housing crisis, is going to replace them. So even if we have a wealthy Rhode Islander leave our state, there's going to be another wealthy Rhode Islander paying their fair share to make their community that they've now decided to call home even better.
Brett Morales, the Greater Providence Chamber of Commerce, is fighting this bill. They're telling legislators that the millionaire's tax has hurt Massachusetts, and they're citing a United Van Line survey saying Massachusetts ranks 7th, while Rhode Island was 5th on most moved to states. What do you say to that?
I think similar to Senator Mack's point, the reality is that it continues to be an unproven myth that wealthy people are fleeing based on the tax code of a respective state. And it's important to note that after Rhode Island cut taxes for the wealthy back in 2010, we didn't see an influx of wealthy people come to our state as a result of that. So similarly, if we are to repeal those tax cuts for the rich, ensure that the wealthy are paying their fair share, and we have the revenue necessary to fund public programs that are going to move our state forward, we're going to have thriving communities. And we're also going to ensure that we have a growing community like we have now, where our population continues to grow each and every single year. And it's a diverse mix of range of incomes of those that live here.
And you mentioned another bill introduced by Senator Quezada and Rep. Bennett that would raise the minimum wage to $20 by 2030. So tell us, what's the minimum wage now, and what would it be in 2026 under this bill?
So the minimum wage now is $15, which is less than $40,000 per year before taxes. And our goal is to ensure that we continue to raise the minimum wage $1 per year leading up to 2030 when it would reach $20.
The National Federation of Independent Business is fighting that bill. It argues the minimum wage goes up, small businesses start to struggle, higher prices for consumer, fewer hours for workers. What do you say to that?
We have to remember that when it comes to our communities, when we have lower wage workers earning more money, they have more spending power that then stimulates our local economies. So in other words, we actually see our small businesses thrive when there is a higher minimum wage because more and more working people have spending power that they're able to use locally.
We'll have more with Senator Tiara Mack and Representative David Morales after a quick break. When you want to go beyond the headlines, let me recommend Rhode Island PBS Weekly. Rhode Island PBS Weekly is an award-winning news magazine broadcast that gives you the full story, powered by investigative journalism and narrative storytelling. New episodes of Rhode Island PBS Weekly drop Sundays at 7:30 p.m. on Rhode Island PBS. Watch past episodes at ripbs.org/weekly. That's ripbs.org/weekly. Senator Mack, I know you've introduced the Crown Act. Tell us what that would do.
The Crown Act is to add hair type and texture as one of the protected class and to prevent discrimination. All of the research has shown that Black and brown women oftentimes face hair type and texture discrimination in their workplaces and are more likely to face discrimination and or job place misconduct or HR complaints due to their hair type and texture and the way that it naturally grows out of their hair. I wear natural hair myself, and I've had natural hair for over a decade now. And one of the things that I find really empowering is that my hair gets to do a lot of really fun things and empowering not just young people, but all people to embrace the way that their hair naturally grows, but also promote more workplace inclusivity amongst all types of people, whether you're a man with curly hair or you're a woman who has kinky coily hair or locks like me. There should be no instance of someone else telling you how you should show up to work and what is deemed professional.
So what are the arguments you hear against this act? Because I know it's been introduced in prior years.
Yeah, I think one of the struggles that we have with passing this piece of legislation is that a lot of people don't typically see a lot of people with natural hair. But we've seen in New England, Massachusetts passed these laws about 2 years ago, and Connecticut has also joined in passing Crown Acts. I think the more we can educate our colleagues to see more people who have natural hair and who show up to a professional workspace who look like me and like my constituents, and empowering a group of young people. Last year, I believe when the bill was being introduced, Senator Ilana DiMario told me about a Girl Scout troop in her community who said that this was one of their priorities that they want to work on. So a group of 11 and 12-year-olds are making legislation like this and inclusivity in their own schools to make sure that their classmates don't feel targeted and feel a part of their community, no matter what the dress code or school code of conduct says, I think is a really important tool for teaching people that the rights and equality for all can be as simple as promoting more inclusive spaces by allowing all types of hair texture to be deemed as professional.
On February 26th, I was there when the Senate passed a bill introduced by Senator Costa that would change the definition of a misdemeanor to be an offense with a maximum sentence of 364 days rather than 365 days. Rep. Morales, can you explain why? I mean, it's just a day, but that's a big deal when it comes to preventing people from being deported for lesser crimes, isn't it?
That would be correct. So just based on the way our statutes are related to immigrant law, there are dangers of deportation when one is found to have a criminal case that carries a severity of a year or more. For us, more often than not, when it comes to misdemeanors and something that is not as serious, a nonviolent crime like shoplifting, one should not find themselves susceptible to a deportation case based on that one mistake. And for that reason, the caucus for years on end now has been advocating to ensure that we revise our misdemeanor laws and have a more contemporary definition around 364 days. That would be right before the 1-year trigger when some of these harsh immigration laws could be enforced. I'm proud that the Senate passed it overwhelmingly, and now we're working on the House side to ensure that Rep. Felix's 364 misdemeanor bill makes it through the finish line.
Yeah, as you point out, the Senate has passed it overwhelmingly, and they've passed it each of the past 4 years. So why isn't the House passing it?
I think we see a lot of concern and silence that comes from the Attorney General's office. And I think it's important to note that we want to work in good faith with them, and we're looking forward to collaborating with them this session in particular and make sure that we move it forward. But it is important to note that when it comes to any piece of legislation, leadership often wants to know what is the perspective of the administrators of the law, those who are going to be responsible for enforcing it. And if they're not getting that vote of confidence from our judiciary system, from the Attorney General's office, there is a level of hesitancy that does exist. But we just want to emphasize, again, how important this is to our communities, and at the same time, also recognizing that this is an approach that other states have taken, and it hasn't resulted in a spike of crime.
Senator Mack, tell us about the bill you've introduced regarding eviction protections.
Yes, well, this is one of my favorite pieces of legislation. I've been working on tenant protections since I've been in the Senate. Just cause evictions is just that. A landlord has to have a reason in order to evict someone, especially in the midst of our housing crisis where we see steep rises in rent, especially in Providence, one of the most expensive metro areas in the entire nation with some of the steepest rental increases year over year. We know that we have to continue to stabilize prices for renters, but we also have to prevent some of the abuses that we see or some of the misuses of the courts as a way to remove tenants from a property in order to get people who will be willing or who are able to pay a little bit more money or even sometimes hundreds of dollars more in rent than the person currently living there. Just cause eviction says that you can't remove someone unless you are going to be replacing them with a direct family member. And then short of that, unless they have not paid their rent, which is still cause and grounds for an eviction because they've violated a contract by not paying their rent on time, or if they do something like have a pet when you have a strict no pet policy, which would also be in violation to the lease. Those are all instances where eviction is still on the table. But removing someone because you have a best friend who's moving into town who's willing to pay $800 more in rent, or you find out that in your neighborhood, people are paying $2,500 for a 3-bedroom apartment, but because you've been renting to someone for 3 years and you've got the rent stabilized at about $1,800, right now with our laws, you can serve an eviction to that person in order to get someone who would be willing to pay a higher price. Just cause evictions is a way of keeping tenants in units longer, preventing unjust evictions. It's an anti-displacement tool, it's an anti-homelessness tool, and it's just really good common sense policy.
While we're talking about state issues, I've also got to ask you about President Trump's attack on diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. One executive order he signed right away claimed the Biden administration, quote, forced illegal and immoral discrimination programs going by the name DEI into virtually all aspects of the federal government. Senator Mack, what's your response to that?
I think diversity makes all communities better, but I think we have to be really specific about what diversity, equity, inclusion is really about. As someone who does this in my day job and who is really committed to making sure that all communities thrive, while we uplift the most marginalized through things like legislation that we passed, like the doula bill, like advancements or pathways to licensure for certified lactation counselors, though that does impact Black people and Black folks in particular, especially when it comes to maternal health, we see that everyone benefits from these policies. When we uplift the most marginalized and we make sure that they are taken care of, we see that not trickle down, but we see that trickle up to every other economic class. We see that trickle over to our allies who don't share our same race, who don't share our same gender. But we know that inclusive and diverse policy that targets the most vulnerable Rhode Islanders is going to be good policy for everyone. And I think we also have to really dig our heels down in the state of Rhode Island and say that this is a state that is founded on religious freedom. It is a part of Rhode Island's story, and it's a part of the legacy of Rhode Islanders to really stand in opposition to voices that say that there are people that should not be or that people that should not belong. We have to say, as legislators, and part of our policy agenda as the RIBLIA caucus, is to be the voice for the people who are traditionally left out.
What would your message to Rhode Islanders be who are scared about what's happening at the federal level? Rep. Morales.
Locally, there are leaders that are here and prepared to fight for you. But even beyond just legislative leaders and elected officials, we have community that have compassion and care for one another. I've been especially motivated and inspired to see Amor, the Immigrant Coalition of Rhode Island, the Onlyville Neighborhood Association, that have stood up and have offered legal resources to our neighbors in need. Those that have been willing to be able to have levels of mutual aid that we hadn't seen in years. And that level of support between neighbors is the strongest form of solidarity that we can have with one another. But at the same time, also recognizing that from a legal standpoint, there are going to be actions taken locally, whether it's through city government, through the state legislature, to make sure that we're defending our communities, especially those that are concerned with the rhetoric and the executive decision-making that's happening federally.
Senator Mack, what would your message be?
Our state motto is hope, and we must always be ready to put that hope into action. With all of the chaos that's going down in D.C., we know that the state level is now the new defender of our democracy and of our rights, and we have committed as a RIBLIA caucus to supporting a right for workers. We've committed to ensuring that tenants are protected. We've been committed to ensuring that consumers are protected. There are local leaders who are saying that even in the face of all that chaos, we're providing Rhode Islanders with the tools in order to protect us from the worst effects of this administration. And so I want Rhode Islanders to know that there is hope, and we have to put that hope into action by getting involved at the local level. There have been dozens of protests happening outside of the State House. Now I want those same people to come inside of the State House, testify on bills, reach out for a coffee chat with your legislator. Make sure you look at policy agendas like what RIBLIA caucus is proposing. We have 15 bills that are people-centered and dedicated to fighting back against the Trump administration, but also focused on building a Rhode Island that works for everyone.
Rep. Morales, Senator Mack, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us, Ed.
Much appreciated.
Rhode Island Report is a production of the Boston Globe in collaboration with Rhode Island PBS. Today's episode was produced by Megan Hall. Audio mixing and mastering by Marissa Ewing of Hemlock Creek Productions. Our music is from APM. Be sure to follow us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. I'm Ed Fitzpatrick. See you next week. Looking to binge watch all your favorite PBS shows? You need Rhode Island PBS Passport. Masterpiece, Antiques Roadshow, Rhode Island PBS Weekly, and many more. Watch them all, anytime, and from any streaming device. Learn more about this member benefit at ripbs.org/passport. That's ripbs.org/passport.